Hello, salam everyone. We'll just give it one more minute and then we can get started. All right, so we can go ahead and begin. Thank you all for joining us. Salam everyone and hello. My name is Layla. I am with Project ANAR and thank you for joining us. I anticipate more folks will be joining us over the next few minutes, but we want to maximize our time here, so we will begin. This session will be recorded and it will be uploaded afterwards. For the sake of time and logistics, we don't have simultaneous translation right now. We will be translating this after the fact and uploading the presentation in Dari and Pashto to our website afterwards. We are really grateful today to be joined by our friends from PANA, San Diego, Raíces, and NorCal Resist to share their experiences assisting asylum seekers, folks who have crossed the southern border in various different ways. And we'll go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So today, our goal is to give all of you an overview of the southern border realities for Afghans and to put you in a better position to support the Afghans that you're assisting who are asylum seekers rather than evacuees or parolees, like those who arrived under Operation Allies Welcome or OAW, because they are in a very different situation. We understand that you all are the folks who are in contact with folks who are in this position, and we are hoping to equip you to be empowered to better assist these folks and to navigate the resources that already exist and that can be leveraged to support Afghans, because there are so many people who have been supporting people of other nationalities who are in a similar legal situation. And this is really an opportunity to use their models of assistance and to build solidarity. Once again, this session will be translated and shared in other languages afterwards. And just to share this up front, a little bit of additional context on Project ANAR and what we are offering. We are a community immigration justice organization. We work nationally. We do advocacy nationally, but we offer legal services primarily in Northern California in the San Francisco Bay Area. We have assisted Afghans who have arrived via the southern border and have been detained in other parts of the country. And if you happen to be in contact with folks in that position, you can reach out to us and we will do our best to take some of those cases directly or offer technical assistance and make referrals when we cannot take them. We can also take referrals in some cases for individuals or families in the Bay Area, whether they have arrived via the southern border or other ways. So briefly to introduce the folks who are joining us, we have Brianna Perez, who is a supervising attorney at Raíces in the pre-removal unit, and Alexandra Cohen from Raíces as well, an advocacy legal assistant in the Raíces pre-removal unit, Humaira Yousufi from PANA San Diego. We'll also be joined by Fatima Jafar from NorCal Resist. Thank you. Okay, so I realize we're moving through this quickly, but there is a lot to cover. So I want to give a brief overview of the current realities at the southern border, and I'll offer space for my co-panelists to add anything here. I just want to name up front that there's a lot of language that's implicated when we're discussing folks who have arrived via the southern border that differs from the type of language that we use when it comes to Afghans who have arrived as parolees through OAW and are eligible for resettlement benefits. And we realize the implications of some of that language, right? When people are viewed as refugees, it connotes something different to when they are undocumented or when they are, they have an illegal entry, what is called an illegal entry based on their legal status. But the reality is that people who are arriving via the southern border, just like other parolees, are in the same position in that they are also applying for asylum, they're seeking protection. And of course, for us and for our organization, we believe that everyone has the right to free movement. And sorry, we'll just move back a slide. Everyone has the right to free movement, and we don't want to create any sort of differences in like who is more deserving of protections, right? And I think that's why all of you are here, right? You're in a position where you're trying to do your best to assist these folks, even when they're not eligible for resettlement benefits just by virtue of how they got here. And the reality is that people have had to come here via the southern border, like those of other nationalities, because they don't have another pathway here. Many who have followed Project ANAR have followed us because of our work with humanitarian parole. That's how we started assisting people with humanitarian parole applications. And we saw how the government treated those. Less than 1% of the tens of thousands of applications that Afghans filed have been approved since the summer of 2021, despite the government collecting more than $20 million in filing fees from our community. So Afghans, like others, have been forced to use any pathway available to them to reach the US. If we can go back a slide still, sorry. We have learned through our own community who's arriving this way. And it wasn't until this week in this article from Reuters that we got an actual sense of how many Afghans have arrived this way. And that article shared this number from the government, just over 2,000 Afghans last year, which is a massive increase. And we can imagine that it might increase the longer that Afghans have no other pathway here. The other thing that we can't spend too much time on this, but Title 42 has been the reality at the border since 2020, which is a measure that has effectively closed the border to asylum seekers. It is going to be forced to come to an end with the end of the pandemic emergency declaration. However, that doesn't mean that now asylum seekers have an accessible border. Currently, the government has laid out a system through the CBP One app, which requires folks of many nationalities to submit an application through this app and seek an appointment if they want to enter at a point of entry. Some people may choose to enter between points of entries, and there's many risks that come along with that. That's not the focus of our presentation today. We are not here right at this moment to advise people about what decision to make if they're trying to come here, but this is the reality now. And unfortunately, there's a very limited opportunity for organizations and lawyers to assist people with the CBP One app, and there's currently not many people at the border who are offering assistance with this, because once you file the application, there's little else that someone can do to help you get an appointment. We will share that there are folks working on getting guidance about this app translated into Pashto and Dari, and hopefully that is something we can share with folks soon. Okay, the next slide. I will hand this now to Brianna.
Hi, everyone. Like Layla introduced me, my name is Brianna Bettis. I'm a supervising attorney with RAICE's pre-removal team. So my team essentially focuses on recent arrivals who are asylum seekers in what is called the expedited removal process. And I can kind of go into what that means in a bit. But I want to touch on what happens to individuals who have crossed the southern border without some sort of visa or other kind of parole permission. Like Layla said, unfortunately, this arbitrary distinction in how someone arrived does have very consequential legal consequences. So the typical path of what happens is if someone crosses what is referred to as EWI, E-W-I, that stands for entered without inspection, and are either turn themselves into border patrol or any other sort of law enforcement at the border, or are detected somehow by law enforcement close to the border, they are transferred into Customs and Border Patrol custody to a processing center. These processing centers have been nicknamed by Spanish-speaking asylees and recent arrivals as hieleras and pereras, which means essentially icebox and dog pound. So you can kind of get an idea of how atrocious the conditions are. From there, Border Patrol can make a distinction of whether they are going to give someone an NTA, meaning a notice to appear, which essentially is a notice that they have an appointment in an immigration court, where an immigration judge will begin their asylum process and they will move forward in that court process. Or they can determine that they're going to place this individual in what is called expedited removal, meaning that they have to prove that they have what is called either a credible fear or a reasonable fear of returning to their home country before they're given, I guess, permission to move into the asylum process. And those individuals placed in expedited removal are typically transferred into an ICE detention facility, which is structured for more long-term detention. It's important to note that at the moment, family units are not being detained together in ICE detention. My team works out of the Carnes Detention Center, which was historically one of 3 family detention units in the US. The Biden administration at the moment is not detaining family units. However, that is a policy decision and it could change at any time. It has not been made illegal. So that's sort of important to remember. However, at the Border Patrol facilities, families are typically separated by gender. So it could cause some family separation for a while, as well as when people are moved into ICE detention at times, we've seen quite a few where perhaps, let's say, one of the parents has arrived more than once. This is not their first time in the US, or they have some kind of documented criminal history. That person may be separated from their family, detained, and their partner and their children NTA'd and bled into the US to proceed with the court process. So there are still avenues in which the government is separating families. So that's kind of the overview of what happens when someone initially crosses and is taken into that CBP custody.
I'll just add briefly, one thing that we have seen with the Afghan families who've arrived this way, who we've assisted, is that sometimes, often we see this, right, that like family as the law defines it is parents and young children, or at least immigration law defines it, but the families that we encounter are extended families, or their older parents and their adult children. And we've seen situations where the parents might end up in one place and the adult children might end up in another.
Yeah, that's a super good point, Layla. Thank you so much. Yes, it is. Unfortunately, immigration has ruined my brain. And when I'm referring to families, I'm referring to the parent of minor children. CBP and ICE do not recognize any other sort of family structure: step parents, stepchildren, aunts, niece and nephews, cousins. So there is quite a bit of family separation. We can move forward to the next slide. So yes, so in terms of legal challenges for recent arrivals, it's important to remember that if somebody has a parole status that is distinct from what OAW evacuees may have had, my experience is more with individuals in expedited removal, but just generally speaking, it's really important to remember that parole is not the same thing as a permanent status in the United States, and it's also distinct from work authorization. So just generally speaking, be cognizant that just because someone has been admitted with parole or NTA'd and allowed to join their family or whoever is serving as their sponsor does not mean that they have work authorization. TPS is another method where individuals can seek some sort of temporary protection. That is not permanent status. It's just sort of a kind of stop-hold measure that the government introduces. Right now, it looks like the date for Afghans is March 15th, 2022, but it looks like that may be redesignated, which is a good thing.
Right. Well, and I think what's important to state there is that all of the Afghans who are coming through the border, like right now, would not necessarily be eligible under this status because they were not present in the United States as of March 15th, 2022.
I think this overlaps a bit with one of the comments that someone submit through the Q&A box. Afghans that come through the southern border do qualify for resettlement benefits if they have parole. If they don't, they're considered undocumented. So this is a complicated issue, which we put a note here. Yes, that is the reality that in theory, some of the Afghans who have arrived via the southern border have been paroled in and may be eligible for resettlement benefits. However, that doesn't extend to their legal status in general. Some of them still have a notice to appear, which impacts what process they're in and how they apply for asylum. And some might have a different type of parole or a different type of entry status, for example, in order of release on recognizance, which makes them ineligible for benefits. So there's a lot to consider on that. There are strategies to address this. Some people have tried, for example, to ask for their status to be changed to parole, but there's not really an across the board answer to that.
We have found success sort of on one-offs, requesting that ICE release somebody under like this kind of parole versus this kind of parole for just those kinds of issues, especially like Cuban arrivals, because there's special protections for Cubans. Like that's kind of historically what immigration advocates have used for. This seems like sort of an analogous situation. So it's worth counsel bugging ICE about this for an individual client. It can make a difference.
Agreed. Thank you. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. What does it mean to be in removal proceedings? So we just mentioned again, some of those Afghans, even if they have parole, might also have a notice to appear. So what does this mean?
Yes, so essentially, if somebody is given a notice to appear, it means their case, like I said, has been given to an immigration court. If that person is released from ICE detention, that is a decision of ICE or the immigration judge if you applied for bond. But sometimes individuals are forced to go through the removal proceedings while in detention. So it's kind of important to keep in mind. If a person is released from detention, they will have two types of appointments and to keep up with the immigration court, of course, appointments. And typically almost everyone has some kind of ICE check-in. It's important to look through the paperwork that your client or the person you're working for is given, because many times individuals are placed into some kind of alternative to detention program. That could be an ankle bracelet. More often now what we're seeing is like a tracking device that looks like a cell phone, which come with their own whole host of issues, as you can imagine. But it's really important to kind of carefully read through the release paperwork so you can make sure to avoid any issues. Sometimes they're given limitations on how many miles from home they can travel and so on. So just kind of be cognizant of that. If an individual is placed into the immigration court process, that means their hearing, depending on the court, depending on the docket of the individual judge, could not happen for months or years. Other times they get scheduled really, really quickly. Generally speaking, it's important to find representation for your asylum case as soon as possible. For everybody, no matter when your court case is scheduled, you have to submit what is called an I-589, which is your asylum application within 1 year of entering the United States. And that's something an asylum attorney should really help with if at all possible. And many times you have to fill out and submit the I-589 before you can apply for a work permit. So that's another reason to kind of get moving on this as quickly as possible. An issue that a lot of people run into is updating addresses if they move, the individual sponsor moves, if they go to live with another family member or friend, whatever the case may be. There are separate forms to send EOIR, the immigration court, and ICE. These two branches of government do not speak to each other, even though it would make sense if they did. So it's important. An individual has, I believe, 5 days after moving to send both of these forms. The government will mostly communicate via snail mail. So having the client's correct address is really important. If an individual misses a hearing with an immigration judge, they will be ordered deported in absentia, meaning without question, just because they are not present in front of the judge. That happens quite a bit. There is also a new process that I think it's important people be aware of. It's not really being discussed too much with the private bar, but the Biden administration has implemented what is called the asylum processing rule. It's only been taken into effect in a certain number of cities, 7 cities at this point. Individuals in expedited removal in that new process, instead of being sent immediately to an immigration judge, are being sent to the asylum office under USCIS for what's called an asylum merits interview, sort of like a mini affirmative asylum application. It's an initial bite at the apple, kind of, to get asylum. And if they're denied, then they go to the judge. That happens really quickly. It's 21 to 45 days from release from detention. That's a very new program. We don't really know too much about it at this point, but it's just something to be cognizant of and really pay attention to the paperwork, because it's being applied in major cities like Boston, New York, Chicago, so on. So just be aware that that's happening. On the screen, there's a 1-800 number. This is the EOIR system hotline. We advise clients to call, or clients or advocates to call at least once a week, because hearing dates change frequently. With the individual's A number, which is sort of like it's called an alien number, which is very ugly, but it's their immigration ID. They can see when their court hearing is, but those frequently change. I just had a client's hearing today move up a week. So it's important to kind of keep an eye on that to make sure you never miss a hearing. And unless an individual has another pathway to some sort of status in the US, most individuals who are in expedited or given an NTA, their only hope for some kind of permanent permission to stay in the US is applying for asylum.
Thank you. So briefly, since we are getting a lot of questions on this is the next thing that we're going to touch on is finding legal representation. So I know we have been getting a lot of emails from many of you about whether there are lawyers that take these cases. And yes, there are. So we just wanted to share briefly some tips when it comes to trying to help someone find representation. So first, a lot of times, as soon as someone gets here, there's an urge to try to get them a lawyer. And maybe they do need a lawyer, especially, for example, if they're in detention, in ICE immigration prison. But in general, if they're like on their way to another destination, if they're preparing to fly to another state to reunite with family or something, it is really good to wait until they're there, and then they can find a lawyer there, at least somewhere where they're planning to stay a little bit longer. Gather whatever documents they have, because that is what a lawyer needs to see in order to consider their case and figure out whether they can assist them, how they can assist them, figure out whether they are actually in removal proceedings. So like we just mentioned, you can call that number, you can see what types of documents they have. If they, for example, they come to you and they already have a court date, that is something really important to mention. Be sure that they keep their address updated, and also look out for local workshops and clinics, because many of the people here have events in the works for the coming weeks and months that will be geared towards this specific group of Afghans. If you can go to the next slide. Also, in general, yes, it's not easy to find a lawyer always, right? Sorry, can we go back one? Again, we will share this PowerPoint with you after the presentation, but there are, sorry, the presentation is moving too much. Okay, right there. There are resources out there for Afghans in general. There is a lot of overlap, and some of those same resources apply to this group of Afghans. There's also other resources that are not specific to Afghans, but they're people who assist everyone who is in the same type of legal status, right? So the Human Rights First form for legal assistance, that is still something that you can use. And it's possible that a case can be placed through that. The Immigration Advocates Network for Pro Bono Legal Services, it's a directory of lawyers where you can put in your zip code, and you can find local immigration legal services organizations that offer low cost or free legal services to people who are in removal proceedings. Still look at the AILA Low Bono directory, the AILA Immigration Lawyer directory. Oftentimes it can be even just like really useful for somebody to have a consultation with an immigration attorney. Again, we are able to take some cases in the Bay Area specifically, but there's organizations across the country that are able to take on cases, and sometimes it's a matter of just doing a lot of outreach. Immigration courts also send a list of the local organizations servicing the area. I'll also let Humaira mention the San Diego legal assistance.
Yeah, so in San Diego County, if someone has crossed through the San Diego port of entry, and if they're detained or if they meet specific criteria for, ICE check-ins and have a court date, they could be eligible for a pro bono attorney through this Immigration Legal Defense Fund provided by the county. So my organization helps a lot of Afghans, who are eligible get into the system. But you could also actually directly contact them yourself as well. And in addition to that, there is state funding through the One California program for removal defense, and there are nonprofits throughout the state of California that do removal defense for asylum seekers. So those are a couple of programs. I can link the list of organizations that are funded through that if that'd be useful.
Thank you. And then we also just wanted to briefly share, obviously this is a lot to cover, but we're hoping that you're able to access these resources after the fact and really take a look at them, and that over time, more and more of these will get translated as well. Just some know your rights resources. While a lot of folks who enter across the border are not necessarily eligible for certain benefits, they still have rights and cannot be discriminated against in certain ways, of course. So they also find themselves getting targeted by various different systems, right? So one that I will pull out and mention here, for example, is in the context of accessing legal services, is that in general, folks in removal proceedings, in fighting their deportation, are sometimes the target of notarios who engage in fraud and take advantage of people and present themselves as attorneys while they are not attorneys. So that when we say that, it's important to make sure that someone is working with the assistance of an attorney. That means like just confirming that this is actually an organization where there is an attorney supervising this work. Sometimes people might access pro se or pro bono resources, right? We have workshops and clinic models that allow us to assist more people, but those are under the supervision of actual immigration attorneys. So that is something to just be mindful for. And we encourage you to dig through these resources. Again, these folks are still applying for asylum the way that other Afghans are applying for asylum, or I should clarify, they still fill out the same application for asylum, even though the process that they're going through is different, where they're with the immigration court generally, as opposed to the asylum office, although some of them may be with the asylum office. But they can still use those resources that exist for the asylum application. You can go to the next slide. I will hand this to Alex.
Hi. We just wanted to briefly go through if an individual has contact with law enforcement, what can they do, what can they not do? Not to say it's common, we have had individuals processed through the detention center who are there because of a traffic violation or something to that effect. So it's important not only for people to know their rights, but also feel more comfortable moving around the city where they're staying. So first, obviously the right to remain silent also applies to those who are going through immigration proceedings, undocumented folks. It is best to not answer questions from law enforcement. Of course, you should never lie about like your citizenship status, but it is best to remain silent. You can request an attorney. If you already have an immigration attorney, you can reach out to them. If law enforcement as well as ICE comes to someone's house, you do not have to let them in unless they have a warrant. ICE can often inflate the authority they have. And it's important that someone asks for a warrant, and it can't be an ICE warrant. So if it has the same like symbol, the same logo from ICE, that is not something that allows them to get into someone's house. So in order to see the warrant, it can be slid under the door, held in front of a closed window. It has to have the correct address. So if it is someone's neighbor, they got the address wrong, that's not a valid warrant. They cannot enter the house. It should also state exactly what law enforcement has permission to search, the scope of the warrant. It is best to, again, call an attorney immediately and let them advise an individual through the process if it is possible. Again, the most important is not the most important, but not lying about the citizenship status. And then really briefly, in the context of wanting people to feel empowered, knowing what like their rights in this process are, I think something we see in Carnes a lot and conversations we have a lot is encouraging people to ask questions through their process. So if they're not understanding something from an immigration officer at a check-in, they should ask questions, they should advocate for themselves, and sometimes that positive reinforcement helps. So that's all. And then the care resources that are translated include Know Your Rights for workplaces, as well as in dealing with law enforcement in several different contexts.
Thank you. Okay, so before we transition to the services piece, I think this is an important question to address that has come up in a few different places, is this question about like, who is ending up with parole status? It seems very arbitrary. It is very arbitrary. That is unfortunately the reality. There are certain things that can impact how someone is processed at the border. For example, there's more risks of being detained if someone has a criminal history, or if the government perceives them as a threat to national security. These are, again, this is very coded language, and these are judgments that are not necessarily rooted in reality, and are ways that all of our communities have been targeted. And we see it time and again that someone is detained for longer and cast as a security threat for the very same reasons that they fled their home country. So yes, unfortunately, it is very arbitrary. There's certain things that people should be aware of that might increase their risks, or that can definitely result in being processed with like a more strict status, or like released from detention with something that confers less benefits than parole, right? And there's just so much else that we can't cover in that regard right now. But that, of course, that impacts the social services piece of this too. So just wanted to briefly address that. And again, there are differences between the type of parole that people get when they cross the southern border and the types of parole that OAW parolees received. And so while some may be eligible for benefits, they are not necessarily eligible for expedited asylum processing the way that that OAW parolees are. But I will go ahead and hand it to Myra.
highlight of just a handful of states that, provide various levels of services. I'll go through California because that's where I'm most familiar with, and happy to answer some questions afterwards as well. But in California, asylum seekers are eligible for emergency Medi-Cal. Some are eligible for full scope Medi-Cal coverage. Those folks who are under 26 and over 49, the governor of California has announced that they're going to bridge this gap and offer full scope Medi-Cal coverage for everyone, regardless of immigration status, but that doesn't actually take into effect until January 2024. So currently, if you're under 26 or over 49, you could be eligible for full scope, but everyone's eligible for emergency. There is also a program that just got passed that will be soon available for CalFresh for individuals who are older than 55. In California, there is also driver's licenses. So you're eligible for driver's license regardless of immigration status. So asylum seekers can definitely apply for that. A law was also passed that will offer state issued IDs, but that doesn't also take into effect until 2024. So we have some great legislation. It's just about, we're in implementation phase right now. In terms of housing, this is like a really big area. I know when asylum seekers first come into our communities, they are, depending on where you're at, they're often offered this like respite shelter between 24 and 48 hours, especially within the San Diego region. We have service providers such as Catholic Charities and Jewish Family Services that provide these like short-term shelters. In order to be released, you do have to say that you have somewhere to go, right? So, most Afghans, what we're seeing is that they're saying, I have a family member in New York, in this area, and that area. But that doesn't actually mean that they have like housing set up there, right? Some individuals have families who are willing to take them in and provide that, support, but many do not. And so in those cases, what often happens is they become like a special case. They can keep them a little bit longer, but these are the folks that need the most amount of support because they are not eligible for, affordable housing kinds of programs. Like mentioned before, they don't actually get work authorization upon arrival, right? You have to wait at least 5 months in most instances to even apply. And after that, what we have seen with the individuals that we've worked with, especially since the pandemic, is that that time frame of like once an individual applies and gets work authorization really varies. Some folks is 30 days, some folks it can be 6 months up to a year. So for them to actually be able to work, and be able to financially afford living on their own is really a delayed process. And so that's, something that is absolutely like, I think an urgent need for those individuals who don't have a strong US tie, who's willing to take them in and offer those kinds of benefit or support. What else is there? I think that's like a really general like overview in terms of California. Layla, did you want to go over some of the other states?
Yeah, I'll also allow Alex, if you would like to jump in about Texas right after. I'll briefly mention Virginia and just like in general about other states that it's going to require some research too, right? There are and hopefully we can compile some of these resources for folks, but there certainly are organizations or state level resources, like Myra was saying, that folks can access, or even like local resources. So at the state level, yes, oftentimes it does depend on the immigration status, what someone is eligible for. But for example, in Virginia, undocumented immigrants may also qualify for free or low cost health coverage, even if they're not otherwise eligible for resettlement benefits. And I like added this to the side here, right? We have found that some local affiliates, and I would be curious if there are folks here from like resettlement organizations or affiliates. Some are able to take these types of cases on a case-by-case basis if you reach out to them, right? Like organizations that they offer housing assistance to other communities. We have had some luck reaching out to them and asking, can they place an Afghan family who isn't actually OAW parolees? That is something they can consider. And other organizations also don't always have those same kind of restrictions with who they can assist. For example, certain religious organizations have some more discretion as well. Alex?
Yes. So shockingly, there are not many Texas state services for refugees. Just like Virginia and California, there might be city or county social service programs. Austin has a pretty expansive one. San Antonio, Dallas, Houston all have some. And then it gets a little more scarce in other counties. So a lot of what fills that gap is a large amount of nonprofits in the area. So Refugee Services of Texas is one office or one organization that has several offices throughout Texas that handles cash support, English language classes, a variety of social services. So unfortunately in Texas, if you are not in a county or city that offers citywide support, it's going to be pretty dependent on nonprofits, some of which can be difficult to access. And it can be kind of a confusing process depending on the organization or the city program.
I'm just pulling this from the chat. Somebody said, we found in Henrico, Virginia, that those who are expecting or have children are getting approved for SNAP. They have notices to appear and have not applied for asylum yet. So yeah, there's, it's not always a straightforward answer. And our goal is really just to show that there is hope that folks can access something, right? And I think that takes us into our next slide here too. Mutual aid. So I think many of you have encountered that there's just so many gaps that we're left to fill. That's why a lot of us are here. We're filling gaps left by the lack of government resources for folks. And that's really heightened when we're working with people who are not eligible automatically for certain resettlement benefits. And even for folks in that category, of course, they're dealing with the same issues where they're running out of housing assistance. And there's great models of mutual aid for us to pull from, and that many of you have been doing, even if we're not calling it mutual aid, to assist the people that you're working with. We'll share some examples, and also I'm hoping, Humaira and Fatima, that you might be able to share a little bit about different strategies that you've used, because there are different things to consider. For example, if someone is operating as a nonprofit organization, you might be limited in what you can do. And of course, like Brianna and Alex, please feel free to add anything here too, because I know this is a piece of what has been done on your team to assist families both while they're detained and after they get released. Humaira?
Sure. I mean, I guess for our organization, we've been helping asylum seekers through, like, that first phase of just getting settled, right? asylum seekers who don't have a place to go, especially, are homeless, right? Essentially, and they need a lot of support. And so we do have a mutual aid that we support asylum seekers, not only Afghan asylum seekers. For our organization, we have been working with, African asylum seekers for quite a while. And so, I'll put the link to our donation page if folks are interested in supporting those kinds of efforts. In terms of, considerations, I think the only thing I would mention, if, a lot of you all are looking to support these populations, is that sometimes there are some limitations in terms of how much funding you can provide to someone who doesn't have a W-9, right? So just making sure that you're taking that into account, or social security number. So taking that into account when you are providing some kind of like mutual aid. Sometimes it's easier to be able to provide funding to a landlord, for example, where you can get a W-9 from them and provide assistance that way, or food, or other kinds of more tangible goods. So I think that's the only thing that I would mention. But of course, I think there is a lot of need. And, what I continuously talk about is that we need more like transitional housing for asylum seekers, especially this population that's so vulnerable. For families as well, it's really, really difficult to put it in areas, especially like San Diego, where rent is so high, to be able to find housing for them, and for them to actually be able to pay rent when they can't even work yet. Right. And so there's a huge need to just be able to, for the community to come together, for those who care about this population, to provide that kind of assistance, as they're able to kind of work through their immigration cases.
Thank you. We are also joined by Fatima from NorCal Resist, who have been doing amazing work assisting folks from various nationalities, but increasingly Afghans as well. Fatima, are you able to share a little bit more about NorCal Resist and the work that you all have been doing?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Fatima Jafar, and I'm working with NorCal Resist. And NorCal Resist is a volunteer organization, and we all work together to support each other. And since December last year, we've been seeing more people coming through Mexico border, especially Afghans with children and pregnant women. And we try our best to help them everyone. And unfortunately, we don't really have enough budget to cover all their costs, but we can provide them urgent staff, housing, foods, and shelter sometime. And also, NorCal Resist is the only organization that can assist Afghan with asylum application in Sacramento area. For example, like in this example that I helped one Afghan family. I was trying to go shopping, and I saw them in the road. And this family has 3 children, and they really don't have the anything, on a rainy day to, like, and not warm clothes, anything. But I called my manager. She came and we took them to the Target. We buy car seat and some stuff for them, and after that we put them in a hotel for 13 days. And after 13 days, we found a sponsor for them, and they helped them for 1 year rent for them. And then, yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for sharing that. I know that we have been able to, we have seen how NorCal Resist has been able to help families and, support them with housing. I know that you all have shared that ways like that you get to the money to people. It includes gift cards, checks. That is one way, like direct person to person distribution of funds like that is one way for collectives to kind of get around some of the restrictions that might exist for nonprofit organizations being able to directly assist someone. Thank you, Autumn, also for adding that additional context on mutual aid and for the contact information. There's can we go to the next slide? Yes, okay. So we have a little bit of time for questions at the end, but I recognize, I don't know if every one of our panelists can stay on. If they can, we will cover a little bit because a lot of other threads have come up. But we also wanted to touch on language resources. So one, Terjimly, they reached out to us. We have used Terjimly in the past. They are a mobile application that is very accessible for on-demand interpretation and translation. And they offer some resources to folks who are in need of translation services. So definitely reach out to them to see what kind of benefits or onboarding deals they can offer you. Respond is another organization that we partner with. I know that many folks here partner with that centers language access and language justice in their work. They, like Terjimly, they are directly connecting you with Afghans who are around the world and who are in need of this kind of, they're in need of work, they're in need of funds. And when you work with Respond, they are paying these Afghans who are in vulnerable situations, and they, yeah, so using their resources is something that we would definitely encourage. You can connect individuals. For example, if you are in touch with someone and they need translation services, you can directly refer that person. They can ask Respond for translation services and they won't get turned away. And as an organization, especially I encourage folks who are here from nonprofit resettlement organizations to use your funds to pay translations services. I know a lot of us rely on volunteers, but it's the same community that is putting their work into translating. So it's really important to compensate them. All right, next. Thank you, everyone. I just want to pull a couple quick questions. The rest we will, like we've mentioned many times here, we will share all of this presentation. It will be translated, including the PowerPoint, and we'll email it to you all so that you can access all of the links. I know that folks are really looking for people who can take their clients' cases or the cases of the people that you're assisting, lawyers for them, and you're looking for housing and like tangible things for them. And that's not necessarily what you have been given right now, right? But hopefully you have more tools to be able to access those things and to be able to support people in accessing those things. And I do think this is the reality of the system, and that yeah, folks are overburdened and need more resources, and hopefully we can continue to work together to advocate for the existing resources out there to be expanded to allow access to these Afghans as well. And then one question that has come up multiple times here is about affirmative versus defensive asylum, and that same thing about like parole. What does this mean? And this is like more of a legal strategy question. I'll let Brianna answer that if you can. That's not the we haven't been focused on legal strategy, but yeah, there's so many options here. Brianna?
Yeah, so come up a couple of times in the chat. Essentially, the distinction between defensive and an affirmative application for asylum. A defensive application is when you're in the court process and essentially you're asserting that you qualify for asylum as a defense to deportation. So for an individual, for example, who's crossed the southern border and been given an NTA, a notice to appear in court, they're in the defensive asylum process. If they prove asylum in front of an immigration judge, then they will have status in the United States and will not be deported. There is also the opportunity to apply affirmatively for asylum, meaning you have not been issued an NTA, perhaps an individual came in on a tourist visa and overstayed, the dates of the visa, or crossed the southern border undetected, or another whatever situation an individual may be in, that they're not in the court process. You can go to USCIS and apply affirmatively for asylum. Those are not determined by an immigration judge. The person will be given an asylum interview with an asylum officer who is an employee of USCIS, and that's how the kind of asylum application is adjudicated. I've seen a couple of questions about like whether that might be a good option for some individuals. It's kind of a lawyery answer, but my suggestion would be to consult with an attorney before making any decisions. They can kind of look at the individual situation, go over the pros and cons of what may happen if you apply affirmatively. It's important to remember, if you do apply affirmatively, you are alerting the government to your presence in the United States. However, that you have to weigh kind of the pros and cons of what it means to live long-term as an undocumented individual. But just so everyone is aware, that's kind of the distinction, and there is that option. And any asylum attorney can kind of walk an individual through the pros and cons of that decision.
Right. Just to briefly add again, so like other Afghans, they might be able to apply with the asylum office. For example, you might have a notice to appear, but it can take months or sometimes it never gets filed with the immigration court. And that means that it can still be an option for someone to apply affirmatively with the asylum office. And again, it depends on each individual case, whether that is something that makes sense, because they won't be processed as fast as OAW parolees. They will be in the same backlog as everyone else, and it can still take a very long time to get your interview or to get a decision if you apply with the asylum office. Although, of course, it can also take a very long time to get asylum if you apply with the immigration court, or if you go through immigration court hearings too. So those are a lot of strategy considerations that folks have to make. This other question here from Becky about work authorization. Yeah, that is also a strategy question that comes up for Afghans in this situation. I know it comes up for example, the migrants who are being bused to different cities, some of whom are Afghan, right? That they might have a type of parole status that is very short term for a couple months, and maybe they apply for work authorization then. It obviously could expire then when they lose that parole status. But we've mentioned elsewhere here where they might eventually become eligible for work authorization after they file an asylum application or other things. And some of these questions, just going through here, I think we've covered a lot of them. You might have to consult an attorney about the specifics of your situation and eligibility for certain benefits. A lot of people here have mentioned different resources that their organizations have. And we also asked about that when folks were registering for the Zoom. And we're hoping to share out more of that so that you all are able to take advantage of the other resources here. So we're hoping that this has been helpful for you all. We will share the recording, share the PowerPoint, and share all of these links. And please send us anything else that we can share from your organizations. Thank you all.